So there's a lot going on here, right? I always have this belief that the politics of California are being done to drive out the middle class. And they basically want to turn California into a feudal system where you have extremely rich and then there's like 20 people to an apartment. Then that's kind of how they want to go. So, you bring up that like 20% of the world's fresh water is coming out of this area. Do you believe, and, do you have a feeling that maybe this is about really eliminating the population or getting rid of the population so they could flip this and turn it into like just a giant corporate environment where these giant corporations control all the water?
Yeah. So a few things your audience should know. Number one, in 2020, the stock market started trading water as a commodity. So they trade oil, and also they started trading water in 2020. If water is being traded by hedge fund managers and Wall Street brokers, you better believe they're doing it for a reason. And it's because, in my view, and based on experts I've talked to, they think there might be a shortage one day. Not just because of drought. I'm talking a shortage of clean water. So a lot of people think wars have been fought over oil. Well, I don't really think it's a conspiracy to say, the next major war could be fought over water. So that's number one. Number two, I can't get in the government officials' heads. I don't think they woke up one day and said, let's just poison these poor black people so we could get them out of the community. I don't think it was as direct as that.
Right.
But I also don't think they necessarily cared that much or even put a lot of thought into the health aspect. I think the first priority, which, by the way, the decisions were being made by wealthy politicians that do not live in Flint. Usually the decisions are being made by people who don't live in the communities they're making the decisions for. I think the first priority was let's, privatize because the new pipeline, the water was going to be raw water. And you could use a lot of raw water for things like fracking, which they were fracking a lot in Michigan, agriculture, auto. I mean, basically, most of the water was going to be used for business.
Right.
They openly talked about it as the blue economy. So I think that in Flint, in Detroit, and many other places, I've seen it. I don't even like the term gentrification because it's just a boring, weird term. I call it economic terrorism because they are trying to basically make it unaffordable and unlivable for the people native to those communities, whether you're white, black, doesn't matter, people that grew up there. And they're doing that through a lot of these privatizing the systems, because when you privatize things, the rates get jacked up. So yeah, I mean, I talked to residents in Flint, and they think a lot of this was a mass gentrification scheme, and you're seeing it in places like Flint. Everywhere I go, whether it's about water or other stories, you see, I don't know, 7 to 10 blocks that are built up and beautiful, restaurants, bars, theaters, and then the rest of the cities are left to rot. So, I mean, in Detroit or Flint, the downtown's wonderful. You drive 10 minutes away, it kind of looks, in some parts, worse than Baghdad.
Yeah, like third world. World.
Yeah.
Of course.
And,
Yeah.
and the places that used to be refuges for people like, like entertainment, especially for, it's become so expensive now that people, really, I mean, if, they're spending more time than ever working, and if they get no break from it, it seems like eventually we're going to reach a breaking point. The society is, not just from a business perspective, but just from a spiritual and human perspective. That's a part that scares me just as much as the rest of this.
So real quick, because we kind of skipped over earlier, what was the major industry in Flint? Was it cars, just like Detroit?
Yeah, so Flint was the birthplace of General Motors. It's the name of Flint. The nickname is Vehicle City. So during the 1940s, 50s, 60s, the industrial boom. I mean, Flint was boomtown. I mean, Flint. I don't know if you ever saw Michael Moore's documentary, Roger and Me.
Yeah.
I mean, at one point, it was like the envy of America. It was like the birthplace of the middle class. So you take that, I mean, less than 100 years ago, 1950s. And how does it get to this? And it's through the offshoring of jobs. So General Motors at one point had like almost 200,000 employees in Flint. Now it's down, I think, to like 20 or 30,000. So all these companies, because frankly, our government, you see the flag behind me, I call it the United Corporations of America, because the government's been purchased. So
Wow.
they let Wall Street and all these other all these industries basically write these trade deals, which allow General Motors and other companies to sell their job, go send their jobs elsewhere. I'm all for other countries having jobs, but not if we're
At
going
the
to
expense of
destroy.
them. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, for sure. I mean,
And
we're compassionate, but it's like, yeah,
right,
I would like Americans to have American industry, of
right.
course.
Yeah.
You
So
know,
General Motors leaving was like the economic death knell of Flint because
yes,
the tax base cratered, and then you have white flight because as General Motors was leaving, uh, I mean, there's no jobs. And General Motors at first, when African Americans came up from the South during the Great Migration, a lot of African Americans came up to work in the auto industry. So you had white people in Flint and Detroit going to the suburbs. And then you had General Motors leaving places like Flint to go to the suburbs before they went to other countries. So there's all these reasons that a place like Flint, which was like a booming economic utopia in the 50s, 60s, some early part of the 70s, then goes to like potholes everywhere. Whole sections of town are abandoned homes with lawn up to here. I mean, I drove through parts of Flint that look like a forest because it's just vacant lots, and that's kind of the backdrop for how you had a governor come in here, declare a financial emergency, appoint these unelected czars, and basically just take over the place. Not that the mayor and city council members and all these places are like the most upstanding citizens that do the right thing, but at least they were voted for. In this case, it was people who nobody voted in Flint to switch to the Flint River. Nobody voted for this new water
that's
system.
so crazy to me, dude. That's so
Yeah.
crazy.
And those are all
And
middle class jobs too. We should say. I mean, there was a time a family could live out with the man typically working in a factory could live off of that salary, and have a great life in America.
Yep.
And now, if the ones that have remained here because of what the economic development divisions of each of these counties has had to do to attract these companies, these become really low paying. The ones that have remained here or that have been lured here. Really low paying jobs that you couldn't possibly support a family on the ones that so it's a terrible
And
situation.
there's a real horrifying and infuriating connection to GM and the Flint Water Crisis. So they switched to the Flint River in April of 2014. And like I said, very quickly, I mean, people were complaining, showing up to City Hall with jugs of brown water. By July, so a couple months later, General Motors workers started noticing that their parts were rusting because they were using the Flint River too. So basically, the river water was destroying their parts. So General Motors started complaining to the state and the city, we don't want to use the Flint River. It's destroying our parts. And it's in my book, but prosecutors, when they were interviewing people, how could you think if the water was destroying car parts, it was okay to give it to humans?
Crazy.
So anyway, General Motors, 6 months after the water switch, they were allowed to switch off of the Flint River.
unbelievable.
The residents weren't.
Just shocking to me that new rules were made for corporations. And again, we want to keep these plants here because the plants give people jobs. So I understand to a point giving them preferential treatment, but at the end of the day, we're talking about people's lives.
Right.
And I don't understand why there's a disconnect from humanity on that.
I think that, I can't say for sure that this is where everything went to hell, but I don't know if you remember in the 80s that movie Wall Street, where Michael Douglas said greed is good.
Yep.
I think something broke in like the collective mentality where it was kind of just like survival of the fittest. I'm going to get mine. I wasn't alive, but I've heard in the 50s, 60s, CEOs would compete with each other in terms of how many, like who created more jobs, like the ice cream parlor guy or the, I don't know, pizza guy. Now it's a competition of like, how many jobs did you cut? And I think that with a thing like Flint, I really think, it's not always as simple as like, these are just evil people. Our government has become a cesspool because
Yeah.
it's all submerged in money. I mean, in Flint, for example, it's so screwed up, and it wasn't reported this way, but basically the driving force behind this completely fraudulent new water system was the local county drain commissioner. That might sound like, what the hell does that mean? Basically, the drain commissioner runs the water for like a county, okay? And this county official who was elected, so a public official being paid by the taxpayers, at the same time was the CEO of this brand new privatized water system. How could you be an elected official while also being the CEO of this new water system? So his elected role was to make the best decisions for the residents' health and safety. But he, as the CEO of this privatized water system, he wanted the water system to be built. And, oh, by the way, he got a shit ton of money from contractors for this new water pipeline and engineering firms and all this, who donated handsomely to his campaign. So there's just conflicts of interest everywhere. I mean, I've reported around the country, there's city council members and local officials who are also real estate developers. And they're literally on the council while making real estate deals, which is a blatant conflict of interest.
100%.
In the Senate, Joe Manchin, he's the head of the Energy Committee, but he owns coal companies. I mean, it's just madness. It's both parties, Democrats, Republicans. And in the case of Flint, like you said, it was clear from the beginning that the water was toxic. And actually, in my book, it shows there was a whistleblower in the Republican governor, Rick Snyder's administration. And 6 months after the water switch, she was actually trying to do the right thing. She sent an email to Snyder's top officials. It was called urgent matter to fix. She cited that General Motors is getting off the Flint River. She said the water's got E. coli, cancers, chemicals, and all sorts of stuff, and we need to switch back to Flint. She was pulled aside, threatened by the governor's right-hand man, so think like The Sopranos and Tony's consigliere. She was threatened by this guy, the governor's fixer, he called himself, told never send an email like that again. And then she had a meeting with the unelected czar, who told her, yeah, we're working on it, but it would be too expensive to switch back to Detroit. Again, because they already were committed to paying the bonds. So if the governor had, or anyone said, you know what, health's more important, to hell with it, we'll have to eat the money or there will be lawsuits, but we got to do what's right for the residents, then you're talking thousands of lives could be saved, because contrary to the government's lies, thousands of people have died from this, from cancer, liver failure, kidney failure, and I know a lot of them.
Legionnaire's disease. Is that what you were talking about earlier, or is that another story?
No, there's a new one. That's another component.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So I also want to get into the media part of this. So this kind of connects. So when they switched the water, and your audience, let me just explain why they got poisoned. So basically, they were switching from lake water to river water. River water is about 20 times harder or more corrosive than lake water. So with river water, you need more chemical treatment, because all water is chemicals are added to make it safe to drink. So underneath us all, California, Michigan, doesn't matter, the pipes that deliver our water are, if you're lucky, 50 years old, but in some places they're over 100 years old. I mean, in Newark, New Jersey, which has a lead crisis, they found pipes still in the ground delivering water from the 1800s. So basically, because of the corrosion, the pipes are very old, so they're corroded, lead, copper, other things. If your city has over 50,000 residents, by law, the water department is supposed to add phosphates. And that's just a scientific term for corrosion control chemicals. So when you add corrosion control chemicals, it basically creates like a protective wall on the pipe, so that lead doesn't leach out. So that doesn't mean you're not going to have any contamination, but at least you want to have lead, which is going to destroy kids' brains and other things. So the state of Michigan, in their wisdom, said, nah, we're not going to add those chemicals into the Flint River water. We'll just send out the water and we'll test it a year later, which A, is illegal, and B, is insane. And a lot of people think they did it intentionally to poison poor black people. So they didn't add those chemicals. By the way, even if they wanted to add those chemicals, as I revealed in the book, they didn't even have the equipment in the plant to add the chemicals. In some cases, they were feeding chemicals through holes in the floor into the water system. So essentially, because they didn't add those corrosion control chemicals, you essentially had acid water traveling through the pipes from a polluted river that GM and all these chemicals had dumped their shit into 100 years, and lead started leaching off. But it wasn't just lead. The media only focused on lead. So essentially, in those pipes, if you're not adding those chemicals into the water, and you also have a lot of these cities, the water system was built for a city when it had double the population. So Flint's water system was built when it had 200,000 residents. When this happened, it was down to 100,000. You have whole sections of towns where homes are abandoned and water is not being used. So what happens is water gets stuck at parts of the system, and it's just stagnant because the water is not being used. And that's not just in Flint. That's in a lot of places. So when water is stagnant and not moving, the chlorine, water departments add chlorine into systems to kill bacteria. The chlorine just gets soaked up very quickly, and then you don't have enough chlorine and bacteria forms. So that's what happened in Flint. They didn't add the proper chemicals for lead, and also bacteria was forming because they didn't add those chemicals. So you have bacteria travel into the water. So pretty quickly after they switched in April, there started to be a surge in Legionnaire's disease. That's basically like waterborne pneumonia. It's more severe than normal pneumonia, and it comes from water. And typically, you could get Legionnaire's from like your air conditioning unit, showers, but it can come from your drinking water too, specifically inhaling it in the shower. So essentially, you had this increase in Legionnaire's cases. And the health department in Michigan, under this Republican governor and this unelected emergency manager in Flint, they knew about the increase in Legionnaire's a month after they switched the water, but they kept it quiet, and they didn't notify the residents of Flint. So then, come August of 2014, a local hospital in Flint, they detected Legionnaire's in their water, and they had an increase in patients with Legionnaire's, and Legionnaire's can kill you, and it killed a lot of people in Flint. There's a local ABC station in Flint that, I don't know if it was accidental, but a memo from that hospital was leaked to them. I think it was accidentally, showing that the hospital had a surge in Legionnaire's and that they were adding hyperchlorinating, like they were adding more disinfectant into their system. So the local ABC station, at the same time that residents are showing up to City Hall with water jugs that are brown, at the same time residents are showing up with plastic bags with their hair, because their hair's falling out in the shower. At the same time, kids are showing up with full body rashes. They got this document, oh, the local hospital has this waterborne pneumonia disease spreading. They're working on the story, and then it mysteriously gets killed in October of 2014. Just so happens a few weeks before the governor's reelection. And then I obtained the phone logs. So I got calls between the governor, his chief of staff, and the head of the health department in the middle of October 2014. And why that time period is really important, and I wrote about it in the book, that's when General Motors got off the Flint River. That's when that whistleblower I told you about in the governor's office had begged them to switch back to Detroit. And that's when the Legionnaire's outbreak, this waterborne pneumonia, was spreading like fire. And the governor's environmental department, the governor's health department, they were all trading emails and phone calls about it, but not notifying the residents of Flint that your water has deadly bacteria in it. So I got the governor's phone calls with his chief of staff, a health director. It showed over 2 days, 22 phone calls between the governor, his health director, the chief of staff. I got documents from the criminal investigation. The prosecutors concluded those calls, they were covering up the Legionnaire's disease outbreak 2 weeks before the governor was up for re-election. Because guess what? Talking about politics and corruption, the governor wanted to run for president in 2016.
Oh my God.
So it's not really a great bumper sticker to, hey, I poisoned my residents. So it was a massive cover up. And another part about the media real quick. 2020, I drove to Michigan. It was like COVID and nobody knew anything, so I drove there instead of flying. I meet with one of the top editors with the Detroit Free Press in a parking lot. It was like 15 degrees. I hand him the documents, showing him all these phone calls, showing him the prosecutors. They concluded all these, they were covering it up, showing them that the prosecution like mapped out their phone calls from 2 years to see like, was this a normal rate that they talk or was this like a spike? These folks barely talked on the phone. It was all within these 2 days that they're talking like drunken teenagers 22 times. The number 2 editor at the Detroit Free Press says, "Holy shit. Yeah, we're definitely interested in doing this. Like, I just got to get sign off from the editor in chief." 3 days later, we don't have enough resources for this. And I got that so many times. I mean, I got from outlets when I got the goods, different parts of the cover up. Is there a Trump angle to this? I said, I don't know. Obama was president when this happened. Frankly, yeah, it's really more like corruption on the state level, but you're telling me I need to like concoct a Trump connection for you to want to do this?
So crazy.
So this is like the media. I don't think people think the media is corrupt, and they are, but I don't think people realize that life or death things are being covered up, not just by politicians, but the media is helping them to just bury it. And in the case of my Flint reporting, of course, it's not easy to like build sources, get documents, and do this kind of work. But the hardest part for me has actually been like getting the media to pick it up because I'm independent. So if I just publish a story on my Substack, it'll do okay, but it's not going to go viral. So that's why I reach out to like the New York Times or the Washington Post or these big outlets, the Detroit Free Press. And they for whatever reason, I think some of it's financial, some of they're just disconnected from what actually matters. They just want to push the narrative that these things are over, that these things are being fixed, and just cover the election horse race and other nonsense. And it's that kind of media abandonment, the media abandoning these stories, or the media not being able to cover things for longer than a week, is why so many people in this country are suffering.